At the start of May 1942, a British cruiser sank in the Barents Sea with 4.5 tons of Soviet gold ingots on board. This is the story of how it got there and how it was reclaimed from the depths decades later. At the outbreak of the Second World War, HMS Edinburgh was one of the Royal Navy's most modern light cruisers. After 2 years of war service, in late December 1941, she was assigned to escort convoys on their new supply route to the Soviet Union through the Arctic Ocean. The Arctic convoys were a fearsome logistical challenge for the British, and the urgent need to supply the Soviets meant that convoys continued well into the late spring of 1942 in the face of increasing attacks by German aircraft, U-boats and surface ships. At the end of April 1942, Edinburgh was at Murmansk, having successfully escorted the convoy PQ-14 from Iceland earlier that month. It was now time for the return leg, and the light cruiser was preparing to join up with the homeward-bound QP-11 as part of an escort under Rear Admiral Stuart Bonham Carter. Before leaving port, though, a very special cargo was loaded aboard under armed guard. It was more than 4.5 tons of gold bullion in 465 individual ingots. This was part payment from the Soviets for the supplies they had received through the Arctic route over the previous months. It had a value at the time of around £1.5 million sterling. In today's money, a value of about 140 million sterling or 190 million US dollars. It was a huge amount of money, stacked in Edinburgh's bomb room at its stern. On April 30th, Edinburgh rendezvoused with QP-11. The cruiser manoeuvred to the front of the convoy and pressed ahead, heading northwest. Little did they know, ahead of them lay the German submarine U-456. Commanded by Lieutenant Max Martin Teichart, the U-boat ambushed Edinburgh with 2 torpedoes. Both smashed into the British cruiser, gouging a hole amidships and totally wrecking the stern of the ship. The rudder was destroyed along with the main propellers, and huge amounts of seawater began to flood in. Edinburgh's captain, Hugh Webb Faulkner, had to quickly order the affected compartments be sealed off in order to save the ship. The damage Edinburgh had sustained was serious, so serious it made the chances of getting to Iceland non-existent. The ship would have to try and make it back to Murmansk. Leaving the convoy behind, the escorting destroyers Foresight and Forester came to her aid, joined for a while by 2 Soviet destroyers that had been trailing QP-11. With this new escort, Edinburgh crawled south at barely 2 knots, having to make constant adjustments with her auxiliary propellers to stay on some kind of consistent course. At 0600 on May 1st, the 2 Soviet destroyers detached themselves and headed back to Murmansk, citing low fuel. They were replaced on station from Murmansk by the British minesweepers Gossamer, Harrier, Hussar and Niger, alongside the Soviet guard ship Rubin and a civilian tug. If Edinburgh was to fail to make it back to port, it would not be for a lack of trying. Meanwhile, away to the northwest, 3 German destroyers were harrying QP-11. Under the command of Commander Alfred Schulz-Heinrichs, the Z-24, Z-25 and Hermann Schumann had sortied early that morning, reaching the convoy by the early afternoon. They duelled with the 4 escorting destroyers, damaging the tribal-class ship Amazon and sinking the Soviet freighter Tsiolkovsky with a torpedo. Shortly after 5 PM though, the Germans turned away, giving up their attack on the convoy in order to bear down on what they now knew was an ailing light cruiser trying desperately to get back to port. Commander Schulz-Heinrichs destroyers arrived at Edinburgh on the morning of May 2nd. Sighted by the minesweeper Hussar, the Germans began to trade fire with the British escorts. Observing this, Captain Faulkner on Edinburgh quickly decided that his ship was not about to sit this one out. The Russian tug was cast off and he accelerated to the ship's maximum speed of 7 knots. As Edinburgh only had use of some of her engines and no rudder, this put the ship into a slow, continuous turn to port. The forward guns were manned, and with the radio fire and director out of action, would be manually aimed. By now, Forsyth and Forrester were engaged at close range with the German ships. The German destroyers outgunned their British equivalents with 5-inch guns, and this superiority told. Both British destroyers took bad hits and were forced to stop, leaving them vulnerable to further attack. But then, out of the mist, spinning in a circle, came the 6-inch guns of HMS Edinburgh. With just their third salvo, Edinburgh incredibly managed to hit and disable the Hermann Sherman. The German destroyer immediately began to list dangerously and came to a halt. With one of their number foundering, Captain Schulz Hinrichs now pulled back his other destroyers from the attack. Forsyth and Forrester got the breathing room they needed to get going again, and the Germans made sure they could pull survivors off of Hermann Sherman before it sank. When the German attack was renewed, it was met by the 4 little minesweepers, who charged head-on to try and protect the Edinburgh. They were massively outgunned and the visibility was poor, but they were determined to drive the destroyers off. But before they could, Z-34 fired a spread of 3 torpedoes at Edinburgh. Captain Faulkner saw them and tried desperately to use the engines to turn the ship towards the oncoming metal fishes, but the ruined cruiser responded just too slowly. A torpedo crashed into the ship's hull, almost exactly opposite one of the holes made 2 days earlier. The ship now appeared almost completely cut in half, with only the deck and the keel holding it together. This could give way at any moment, so it was time to abandon ship. The minesweepers Harrier and Gossamer came alongside and were able to take the crew off relatively easily, as Edinburgh was now so low in the water that the ship's decks were about level with each other. Altogether, 790 of the 847 crew were saved. HMS Forsyth then sent Edinburgh, and her vast quantity of gold, to the bottom with one final torpedo. For decades after her sinking, Edinburgh lay undisturbed at the bottom of the Barents Sea, even though both Moscow and London were well aware of the huge value of the cargo on board the wreck. Edinburgh was formally marked as a war grave in 1957, which effectively ruled out the easiest form of salvage, known as blast and grab. This was to simply blow your way into the wreck with explosives and take what you came for. As you can imagine, there was little chance the British Ministry of Defence or public opinion would tolerate that on a war grave. As a result, it wasn't until the early 1980s that a consortium of British firms were able to secure the necessary approvals for a salvage attempt. The consortium planned to use divers to cut into a small part of the wreck and retrieve the gold, while doing the minimum amount of disruption to the rest of the ship. Finally, at the end of April 1981, long-awaited approval from the Soviet government was granted, and the consortium was able to begin its salvage attempt. First though, they had to find the wreck. On the face of it, this was no easy task. Edinburgh had made dozens of course changes in the 2 days before she sank, and in the chaos of battle her own plotted positions were likely to be inaccurate. In fact, reports from multiple ships had given Edinburgh's location at different positions scattered across an area the size of Greater London. Substantial work would have to be done to work out which of these sightings would be most accurate. Eventually, it was ascertained by Kip Punch of the survey company Rakow Decker that the minesweeper HMS Harrier's track was probably the most accurate, since it had made the fewest course corrections since leaving port, and therefore its positions should be the closest to accuracy. At the end of April 1981, the survey vessel Damtor sailed to confirm the location of Edinburgh. Almost 39 years to the day since the ship's sinking, grainy images of the ship were beamed back to the Damtor, with Edinburgh lying at almost the precise location Harrier had plotted decades before, 244 metres below the surface. After a few months of preparation, the actual salvage operation was able to begin in September 1981 aboard the salvage ship Stefaniterm. It was a tremendously risky operation, both physically and financially. The divers would be working at world record depth for this kind of operation. As Rick Wharton, one of the architects of the salvaging, puts it, "We were going off into the unknown, at depths never before attempted, in hostile waters both physically and politically. We were now embarking on the diving equivalent of the first moonwalk. The salvage attempt was to be carried out using what's known as saturation diving. On September 2nd, 8 divers entered a special sealed set of chambers on the Stefanerturm, which were then pressurised to the depth they'd be working at on the seabed, equivalent to 23 atmospheres. Each day, in shifts, they'd commute down to the wreck for work and return to the saturation chambers after they had finished. This way of working meant that the divers did not have to make lengthy decompression stops at the end of each dive. Instead, they would remain compressed as if they were on the seabed 24/7 until the job was done. If, for whatever reason, they needed to leave early, they'd be unable to without a lengthy decompression process. On September 4th, the first dive to the wreck took place. Initially, progress seemed very slow, as the divers had to assess the best route to the bomb room where the gold was stored and cut their way through the armour plating to access it. Inside the ship, there was a large amount of debris between them and their target. To complicate matters more, when the divers eventually reached the bulkhead of the bomb room, they found a large hole in it which had been gouged by a German torpedo. This was partially good, as it meant there was no build-up of explosive gases from decaying ordnance on the other side, but also a massive hindrance, as the bomb room had become covered in layers of silt and debris. For day after day, round the clock, the divers worked tirelessly to clear the bomb room, keeping a keen eye out for any flashes of gold. Finally, on September 16th, on dive number 27, at 10:48 p.m, they found it.
Christ, you didn't give me a heart attack, man, for Christ's sake.
And where there was one bar, more followed. Over the next 3 weeks, hundreds of ingots were brought up. The peak was the 40 bars retrieved in one dive by Dougie Matheson, worth £4 million alone. By the time the diving operation had to be suspended on October 8th due to worsening autumn weather, 431 of the 465 gold bars had been recovered. It was an astonishing achievement. We had recovered 93% of the Edinburgh's cargo from a record depth in the most hostile waters in the world, and we had done it without any serious injury. The haul was worth around £40 million sterling in 1981, a value roughly equivalent to 140 million in today's money. It was a huge amount, which ended up being split at various percentages between the British and Soviet governments and the consortium which had put together the salvage efforts. Before departing the wreck site for Murmansk and then the UK, the crew of the Stefanerturm held a short memorial service, throwing a wreath over the side to commemorate the 57 sailors who went down with the ship 39 years earlier. 5 years later, in 1986, the Salvage Consortium would return to retrieve 29 more bars from the wreck, finally concluding the remarkable story of HMS Edinburgh and her golden cargo.